Okay, so welcome everybody. It's really great to see you all this afternoon. We'll get started. I'm just going to say a few words about the format that we're going to use today, and then to put the seminar in context of FJI's work more broadly. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Vicky Donnelly, who will introduce the panelists. So there's three of us from FJI on the seminar today, myself and Vicky, and Hilary Darcy, DCE coordinator, is also here. It's really great to see you all. The format that we're going to use is we've asked the three panelists to prepare just 10 or 15 minutes of a presentation. While each of them are speaking, feel free to leave questions or comments in the chat box. And then at the end of each person's presentation, we'll just give it a flavour of what's coming up in the chat box. And we'll come back to that in more detail at the end. Yeah, so whenever the three panelists finish their presentations, we'll open a space for each of the three panelists themselves to share any responses that they have to each other's presentations. And then at the end, we'll do a Q&A. Before you leave us, we'll just share a little bit about a couple of upcoming events that we have going on at FJI that you might be interested in. And we'll ask you to fill out a short evaluation before you leave. That's sort of the format that we're going to use today. So just in terms of the topic for today's seminar and FJI's work, so the title for the seminar is Get Over It, from Immobilizing Information to Transformative Action. And the question, like one of the sort of guiding questions with this for us is, what are the qualities and perspectives that we need to cultivate in ourselves and others to be able to face existential threats? So in relation to FJI's broader work, as many of you know, we have a very specific remit around economic and financial justice issues. And our work historically has been a combination of research, campaigning, and education work on those issues. FJI is 30 years old this year, and we're very excited for our 30th anniversary event coming up in September, October. We'll be back in contact with you about that. So those 30 years have been a story of two halves. So before 2008, was a very strong focus on education and campaigns on debt issues and debt cancellation campaigning in solidarity with global south countries. And then since 2008, the bank bailout and the IMF coming to Ireland and the austerity that followed, the focus of the work broadened to also include the impact of these global financial structures and institutions in Ireland, and Ireland's role in facilitating these structures, particularly in terms of corporation tax issues. So our education work focuses on these big sort of meaty issues of the economic and financial system, and next then to issues such as climate, gender, housing, and others. And then organizationally, we've gone through quite a big change in the last few years with a completely new team now in place. And we, as the new team, are acutely aware that we've inherited from our predecessors this amazing body of work for educating and campaigning on economic and financial justice issues. And we see as one of our challenges and priorities being to figure out how we do that work in ways that don't leave people overwhelmed, feeling overwhelmed. One of the pieces of feedback that we keep hearing from people has been that our content is a bit heavy, a bit dense, and difficult to digest sometimes. This came across really strongly in a series of needs assessments that we did with a group of educators and trainers who have taken part in our adult education course at Commonwealth. And it came across really strongly in other needs assessment and context analysis work that we were doing with partners in our other education work in the formal and informal sectors. So we've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of consulting with different communities we work with about the challenges in terms of pedagogy and in terms of educational approaches. Rather than overwhelming people, attempt to bring people on a journey or go on a journey together with them that's engaging and empowering and moves towards new perspectives and paradigms, understanding and working to transform the economic and financial system So on this, as part of this process, on this journey and outreach and learning that we've been doing, we came across Audrey's work, we came across Sive's work, and now Suprabha's work, and we felt it was a really opportune time to open up this conversation to others working on these and other related issues with that general focus on education and social change. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Vicky Donnelly now, who will introduce the panelists.
Thanks, Thomas. It's a real pleasure to introduce these three wonderful, committed, innovative educators that will be sharing this afternoon. We're going to hear first from Dr. Audrey Bryan, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology in the School of Human Development at DCU, Dublin City University's Institute of Education. Audrey has published extensively, nationally and internationally, in the areas of climate change education, gender and sexuality studies, racism and anti-racism, and critical global citizenship education. And today, Audrey is going to explore her current work that focuses on overcoming psychic barriers to receiving difficult information and the role of emotion in teaching for social and global justice. Then we'll be hearing from Sive. Sive works in CoLove as the Training and Education Officer, as well as being part of a number of all-island training panels, including Children in Crossfire's Educating the Heart programme and FJI, our trainer group here. Sive's interest in and her commitment to decolonial approaches for global citizenship education was seeded back in 2018 when she participated in Bridge 47's year-long transformative learning journey project. And today she'll be sharing reflections from her ongoing engagement with decolonial pedagogies, including body-based practices and the why of mobilizing our whole bodies and senses in the service of transformative learning and ultimately justice. And Suprabha Seshan. Suprabha is a conservationist and environmental educator committed to the rewilding of habitats and human beings. Suprabha lives and works in the Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary in the Western Ghat Mountains of Kerala in India. Learning from nature to protect nature better is the work of GBS, the Botanical Sanctuary, through its integrated conservation practices in land, species, and community-based ecological nurturance. Suprabha has been engaged with a wide range of groups and a wide range of education approaches that are forest-based, and she'll share some of her experiences of over 30 years of living and working in the Gurukula Sanctuary. So thank you for all of that. We're going to hear from each panelist for 10 to 15 minutes. And as Thomas mentioned, we'd encourage you to sort of, as questions or responses are coming to you, feel free to put them into the chat or to put them into the chat at the end of each presentation, and we can get a flavour of them as we're going along. But we'll return for questions when we've heard all three speakers. After our three speakers, we're going to take a short break, so there'll be a little bit more time to reflect then about what you'd like to ask or what you'd like to share yourselves to. But I'm going to begin by inviting you, Audrey, if you'd be willing to start us off, please, with your presentation or what you'd like to share with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for that really lovely, generous introduction. And thanks a million to Thomas and Hilary for the invitation. I'm really excited about our dialogue this afternoon. I'm just going to stick a timer on there just in case so that I can just keep to the time limit. And thanks everybody for being here. It really means a huge amount, not least because it's such a gorgeous day outside. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Sive and Suprabha as well. So yeah, I suppose what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the approaches that I use in my own teaching. And I suppose what I would like to do is maybe draw out some of the kind of concepts, principles, and ideas that inform my own approach to development education or global citizenship education, maybe more so than some of the kind of practical or experiential aspects. And my sense is, from having spoken to Sive, that this is something that she's going to speak more directly to. But in the course of the conversation, of course, of the discussion afterwards, I can speak directly to particular experiences or practical considerations. But I suppose I've been trying to foreground emotion in my teaching for about 15 years now, primarily through the lens of what I variously call affective pedagogies, and more recently, I suppose, a pedagogy of the implicated, which draws on the work of people like Holocaust scholar Michael Rothberg, the psychoanalyst Deborah Britzman, and decolonial scholars such as Vanessa Andreotti, Sharon Stein, Karen Pashby, and so on. And I should say at the outset that I don't really find this kind of work particularly easy, and it's largely through my own kind of struggles that I've come to where I am in it. Found it particularly challenging as a novice educator in a university setting. And Vanessa Andreotti likens this kind of work to learning to walk a tightrope between naive hope and desperate hopelessness. So I think that gives us a sense of just how challenging this kind of work can be. So this concept of the pedagogy of the implicated that informs some of my most recent work particularly in terms of climate change education is concerned with the ways that individuals contribute to and indeed benefit from various historical as well as present day injustices through their positioning as implicated subjects. So that's the kind of terminology that Michael Rothberg uses that I'm drawing upon. And what this means is that rather than being merely victims of or bystanders to or perpetrators of various forms of wrongdoing, implicated subjects indirectly participate in or perpetuate various social and global injustices. So, for example, Rothberg talks about how as taxpayers, we're implicated in the actions of our governments, even if we're personally ideologically opposed to their policies. So it's this idea that it's very hard to escape your own involvement or implication or complex entanglement in larger structural injustices. So it's an attempt to kind of look at the interaction between individual level actions or practices or behaviors and wider sort of social forces or structures, which I think often is something that kind of doesn't get teased out sufficiently within the context of transformative education or social justice education or indeed activism. So there can be a tendency, to sort of maybe taking the example of climate action, for example, to shy away from this focus on individual behaviors, because there's an argument that, well, to focus on individual behavior in the context of the climate crisis is really a distraction from, these bigger culprits, these larger entities, institutions, corporations that are ultimately responsible for the crisis. But to my mind, there's a lot to be done, a lot of work to be done in terms of teasing out the complex intersections between individual level practices, behaviors, actions, and wider structures and wider social forces. So that's what drew me to this pedagogy of the implicated, to try to look at the symbiotic relationship, as it were, between what we're doing on an individual basis and these larger institutional forms of harm, as it were. And my interest in then, I suppose, the emotional dynamics of teaching and learning emerged largely from my own experiences as a novice teacher in a university setting. You know, I suppose I've been teaching now within the field of teacher education for over 2 decades, but my initial entree into that was quite challenging, not least because many of my students resisted a lot of the ideas and content and knowledge that I hoped to transmit to them. So I'll say a little bit in a moment about kind of this idea of knowledge transmission and how problematic that is. So Deborah Britzman, who's a psychoanalyst and an educationalist, talks about this kind of knowledge as difficult knowledge. So I found her kind of way of thinking and talking about these ideas very helpful. Difficult knowledge refers to content knowledge that is socially traumatic. So, for example, knowledge about the atrocities and injustices that are linked to historical as well as present day manifestations of racism, the effects of war, genocide, the climate crisis, and so on. These constitute forms of difficult knowledge. And from Britzman's perspective, it's not just the content knowledge that's challenging, it's also the learners or the students' psychic encounter with that difficult content. So how they react to it, how they respond to it, their ability to receive and engage with it, okay? So in this sense, it's knowledge that's demanding, as in it's demanding something of the learner. It's asking them to consider their own role in the conditions that they're learning about, and to consider their ethical responsibilities in relation to those who are suffering. So it's a demanding form of knowledge, and it's difficult in the sense that it's socially traumatic. So in my case, at least, as these resistances, and in some cases, students' actual refusal to engage with difficult knowledge, as these kinds of interpretive standoffs that I was having with students, as they were becoming more commonplace, I started to feel just completely overwhelmed. And I started to look to various sources for deeper understanding of what was going on in my classroom. And I became more and more interested in the emotional, or what's sometimes referred to as the psychoaffective dimensions of teaching and learning. So through my kind of exploration and my own kind of crisis of confidence, I came to realize, I kind of stumbled upon a body of literature that actually documents these resistances to difficult knowledge. And I came to realize that having a handle on what was going on in the classroom and in students' minds was key to effectively navigating my role as a global citizenship educator. So what I'm going to do for the remaining 10 minutes or so is, I suppose it's to highlight particular ways of thinking and knowing that have helped me personally in how I approach so-called difficult knowledge. So it's not really, it's more, I suppose, a pedagogical ethos or a sense of pedagogical responsibility rather than particular methods or modalities that I'm going to be speaking to here. And I think one of the most helpful ideas that I came across, again, is kind of leaning on Deborah Britzman's work. But when I was struggling so much as a novice educator, I came across this book that she has written called Practice Makes Practice. And it's about how student teachers learn how to become teachers. But one of the things she talks about in that text is the idea that there are certain myths about teaching that are, ingrained within us, that affect our practice. And one of the most prevailing myths of teaching is this idea that teaching is primarily a matter of knowledge transmission, and that learning is a matter of knowledge accumulation. Okay, so we're probably kind of familiar with this idea of the kind of the so-called info dump, where we're kind of bombarded with so much information, we struggle to make sense of it. Another idea that I find kind of helpful is this notion of infowhelm. So Thomas spoke at, at the outset about, the idea of participants feeling overwhelmed. And I think we can feel, overwhelmed by information. So this idea of kind of, the info dump linked to the idea of teaching being about kind of knowledge transmission, which can lead to infowhelm. So teaching according to these kind of, more stereotypical understandings is widely understood as a problem of ignorance, right? So in other words, we teach because we presume students don't know things, and that, they need to be kind of filled with certain kind of ideas and bodies of knowledge. And that this ignorance can be fixed with things like facts, evidence, convincing argumentation, critical thinking, and so on. Okay, so it's quite a rationalist sort of view or perspective on what teaching is. And we see this in, mainstream forms of teaching, but also in, various forms of critical education as well. So what I came to learn through my own journey in this process is that learning is actually infinitely more complicated than this. And it involves not just cognitive or, epistemic issues, but it also is really fundamentally social. It's moral and ethical. It's relational in the sense that it's about, the dynamic between teachers and students, the dynamic between students themselves, how students are relating to the world, the wider world, around them. And it has affective components, such that there can be psychological obstacles that get in the way of learning, okay? Particularly as it relates to these more difficult forms of knowledge, right? So psychoanalysis would refer to this as kind of defense mechanisms, okay? But, a simpler way to think of it is just that there are these psychic barriers that kind of get in the way of your ability to have a meaningful pedagogical encounter with difficult knowledge. So Elizabeth Ellsworth, who's one of the other kind of, thinkers who has really shaped my own views on teaching and learning, talks about pedagogy as a social relationship. So she says it's something that gets right in there, gets in your brain, in your body, in your heart, in your sense of yourself, of the world, and of others. Okay, so if our starting point becomes less about, this idea of teaching being about, the accumulation of facts and offering really convincing evidence and gathering the most persuasive forms of methods, and we step back and think about how learners are affected by what they're, being confronted with, in the context of difficult knowledge. I think that becomes the basis for, a more potentially truly transformative form of learning. So that particular realization was quite hard one for me. As I said, it was, really difficult for me in the beginning, but my encounters with students who resisted or refused or who were immobilized by the knowledge that I was trying to transmit led me to, I suppose, a deeper interest in this question of what knowledge actually does to learners, right? And indeed what learners themselves do with knowledge, including the ways that they variously ignore it, resist it, disavow it. In other words, to know something and not know something simultaneously, which is something that human beings have an incredible capacity for, to accommodate knowledge, to internalize it, to embrace it, or indeed to embody it. So there's a myriad of ways that students can react or respond to knowledge, depending on, their circumstances, their psychobiographies, the kinds of knowledge they've been exposed to before, and so on and so forth. So there's an unpredictability to all of this as well, I think, is kind of one of the key points that I'd like to stress, and maybe we can talk about that later in the discussion. So in the remaining couple of minutes, I just want to maybe give you more of a flavor of what the approach that I take looks like. So first and foremost, it foregrounds affectability. In other words, the ability to be affected by difficult content knowledge, and it seeks to explicitly legitimize emotion. So in other words, whereas a lot of mainstream educational thinking perceives emotions as largely irrelevant to education because it's grounded in this very rationalistic understanding, the approach that I take now, at least, is one that really tries to legitimize emotion and to foreground emotion and affectability. So in other words, it presents emotions as an essential feature of who we are as human beings and as natural and inevitable aspects of the teaching and learning process. So, for example, one of the quotes that I like to use in my teaching with students is a quote by Sylvia Plath, and she says, "I don't know what it's like not have deep emotions. Just even when I feel nothing, I feel it completely." So there's this sense in which you have to psychologically prepare students for the range of emotions that they're likely to feel when exposed to difficult knowledge. And in foregrounding emotion and affectability, I try to advance a relational understanding of what emotions do, rather than a more traditional or individualistic understanding of emotions as, kind of residing within us, belonging to me. So it's a very different way of thinking about emotion than a lot of people are used to initially. So it asks students to consider such things as what function particular emotions serve. So, for example, rather than getting stuck in this sense of, powerlessness or hopelessness or immobilization, it sort of asks students to consider what function those emotions serve and in whose interest is it for me, to remain powerless, feeling hopeless, feeling immobilized. And it asks them to consider those emotions in relation to, others, including so-called distant others. Okay, so what function do particular emotions serve and in whose interests? And the idea is to create a space where emotions can be met and explored through dialogue with an eye towards their political and ethical consequences. So it takes us, obviously the individual and the subjective is key, but it's always at, looking at that, or with an eye towards looking at that in relation to others and in relation to wider social forces and structural injustices. So this, of course, means that some of the content knowledge is going to be quite disruptive to learners' sense of themselves or their self-understanding. So, I think those of us who work in the global citizenship education space will be familiar with, the idea that many students they feel that they want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, and therefore they see themselves as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And when they're being confronted with, difficult knowledge that complicates that and also complicates their sense of themselves as, good citizens or compassionate or empathetic, caring individuals, it can be quite conflictual. It can be quite challenging. So, you know, I said I wasn't going to dwell too much on particular methods, but the kinds of resources that I find most valuable in trying to work through these complexities are things like film, poetry, and art that speak directly to notions of implication. So they're a little bit dated now, but I mean, documentaries like Bamako, like Life and Death, like Darwin's Nightmare, like implication and complicity are kind of core concepts that are embedded within those kinds of documentaries. And it's through making those explicit, I suppose, and bringing those into conscious awareness that I think some of these more meaningful conversations can happen. So it's about inviting learners to critically examine their emotional responses to difficult content knowledge, thereby facilitating a greater sense of emotional self-awareness, greater levels of emotional discernment and attunement. And I do that through particular types of questioning. And in some of my earlier writing, I've kind of written about the kinds of lines of inquiry that you have to pursue, or that are desirable to pursue, at least to bring that sort of self-awareness and attunement piece to the fore. So things like guided discussion circles, small group discussion, and assignments that foreground emotion I found very helpful. So I don't think this will come as any surprise to, you know, any of you working in the development education space, but it means having a sensibility towards, you know, open-ended, dialogical, improvisational, emergent, messy kind of approaches, pedagogies, you know, and this is where the unpredictability kind of comes in. And also, I suppose, being okay with the reality that not everybody is going to embrace what you're doing, and there are going to be a certain number of students who just will never really, you know, meaningfully engage. So yeah, another kind of element that I make explicit is just this reality that this type of learning is going to be conflictual. Okay, so not least because it's addressing fundamental questions of power, inequality, vested interests, denialism, resistance, anxiety. So to explicate that and to present it as an inevitability or as a likelihood, and naming it as such, I think can be helpful in terms of not necessarily diffusing some of the conflict, but being able to identify it and work through it. So here I found Lisa Taylor's work really helpful in terms of normalizing what she calls the D's of resistance, which is a discussion-based activity exploring ways in which we resist difficult knowledge. And there's just finally then one or two other things that I find very helpful. I suppose I draw a lot on humor and laughter and comedy as modalities and resources for legitimizing emotion. I think they can be incredibly helpful in terms of diffusing and displacing difficult feelings like immobilization, hopelessness, powerlessness, and so on. And this can be tricky. It can be, you know, it's sort of a fine line, I think, within development education when, you know, I suppose you don't want to trivialize people's suffering, and you don't want to trivialize immiseration. But I think if we look to, and again, I'm kind of going to draw here on the climate change example, if we look at the prevailing models of climate change education and climate change communication, they're not working, they're ineffective, in part because they're just so serious, and it just paints this really catastrophic picture. So I kind of use humor and comedy as sort of what I kind of describe as a slantwise or sideways entry point into really difficult forms of knowledge, particularly for younger audiences and younger children. And then finally, you know, I suppose one of the kind of fundamental principles of this type of work is the importance of instilling critical hope. And it isn't just about, or, you know, it's not at all really, I should say, about trying to supplant negative emotions with more positive ones. But I do think that, you know, without critical hope, we're doomed, you know. So I like to draw on here, you know, the likes of, let's say, the work of Howard Zinn. He talks about how what we choose to emphasize in our complex history will determine our lives. To me, it's a really powerful kind of way of thinking about how we approach our teaching. So he argues, well, if we only see the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. But if we remember those times and places where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. So thank you so much for listening. That's me.
Oh, thank you so much, Audrey. That's and what a beautiful note to finish on, that sense of critical hope. And thank you for you know, the vast range that you covered in such a short amount of time, but for bringing us back to that role of emotion and relationship in shaping how we might approach these difficult knowledge, but really crucial knowledge and crucial issues. So thank you so much. And if people had things that they'd like to kind of start to put into the chat, in terms of just thoughts, responses, it can be single words if you like. We're not going to ask you for essays or anything. But if you'd like to sort of start to input your responses or questions, this would be lovely to sort of see them emerge. Thomas, is there anything so far that we could hear about?
There was just one, sorry, one comment earlier on from Emer, who's teaching home ec and on family decisions and how we impact what big companies do to the environment in our pockets. And I suppose the core of it is that students find themselves helpless, and the stress is something that they wish to avoid. So yeah, very, very relevant there. And just a request then for the list of resources referenced. We can follow up with that afterwards, Sunny.
A great reading list for the summer. Thank you. Thanks so much, Audrey. Sive, if it would be really lovely to hear from you if you feel ready. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Audrey, for all of that. It's so, you know, I was thinking yesterday about how I do practice. I build some curriculum and I facilitate and so on, but I'm not often talking about that. I'm just doing it. So to prepare for this and to think about what I might say was interesting, but then also to then hear others then do the same, to talk about their practice in a forum like this, and to hear Audrey there is really, really interesting. And then just to see the overlaps, how there's difference in terms of like really interesting points of difference, but the same. So saying something, Audrey saying things that, yes, me too, me too, me too. So that's just, it was really nice to listen there. I guess in terms of, I just put a timer as well, just to be careful. But I suppose my position is, or I'll be speaking from the next 10 minutes or so, is more so as a facilitator, educator, so working in non-formal education with adults, and also with also adults within organizations, so hosting courses and building curriculum, but then also working with organizations that are within the co-op with using GCE approaches. So that's kind of where I'm speaking from. I don't know, I guess, does it matter? Does it not matter? Maybe it will help in your listening. But at the same time, there's so much overlap with what Audrey was saying. And I was thinking about why why my turn toward working with emotion and maybe attention to soma, to like whole body in the education space. And I think like there's a lot to feel. There is a lot to feel about what's going on now and what it means to be wherever you are, what it means to be like with your feet on the ground in 2023 on this earth. And like Audrey was saying, that a lot of that stuff that's feeling is occluded from the education spaces, even the GCE non-formal adult spaces. There's a big, what I kind of noticed some years ago when I started working in this field, a big emphasis on knowledge to action. So very much like Audrey was saying, even in more non-formal spaces, we're not talking about lectures and classrooms where people might expect knowledge transmission, but even in non-formal spaces, knowledge transmission model. Give me knowledge and input on the state of the world and the terrible things that are going on so that I might act and be and help save it. And so I will move to action. I will receive your knowledge and I will move to action. And I mean, obviously that's very blunt, like kind of very broad brushstroke, but that's that feeling of like, well, you know, it doesn't seem sufficient because knowledge is not the problem. Not lack of knowledge isn't really the only problem here. It's that kind of the engagement, the capacity to engage with the knowledge, you know, and building that capacity to actually meet it and make contact with it, which is maybe the more interesting point. And for that, you need to do some more tuning in. For that, you need to create a little bit more space. And I think the knowledge to action kind of thing anyway, it implies that you give me knowledge and then accompanying that knowledge will be a how-to. So you'll tell me how to build a good campaign, how to be a good citizen, how to be an active citizen, how to do good, how to fix, there'll be how-tos in this. You know, there's also that expectation of something about a how-to. And I don't think that guides people. I don't think that does give people the ethical compass to navigate really complex contexts in which they're implicated. And it also kind of maybe closes down space for consideration of how this thing I want to change is actually something I'm part of. So just like Audrey was saying, the implicated self, the knowledge to action thing kind of also shuts down space for that. So I find that working with the affect, how people are coming at this stuff and how they're relating to this stuff in time, in here and now, it animates the right direction. It has more chance of animating the right direction. It brings up like a compass, you know, and it means that the likelihood of someone steering out of that room and steering towards something, it's more likely to be in a given moment the right action. So okay, I can't like provide facts and figures on it, but that's my feeling from the kind of the kinds of reflections that emerge when you use these kinds of approaches. There's a couple of things I'd say about working with this stuff though, and I think it's within GCE spaces, maybe those that I circulate in, which is again maybe more non-formal youth community sector, adults, non-formal sector kind of stuff, is what's not talked about and what I'm so interested in, but doesn't get talked about, is like what it means. Like if you're a facilitator and educator working with this approach, with these approaches, similar approaches, it means that you're dialing down the primacy of knowledge and content in the space. You're dialing that down, and you need to dial up then your presence, your attunement to what's happening in the room. You know, and so what does it ask of you then? Because if you dial down the content knowledge, it means that you have to let go of that familiar place of being expert, of being in charge, of being an authority. Fine, maybe that's something that maybe you'd be willing to concede a little bit. But then the dialing up of the presence is quite a thing. And you need to do that because you're asking the people in the room to bring their presence. And you need to be tuned into what may be there and anticipating what they might be bringing. And you need to be able to work with what they will bring. And you need to provide some kind of, and I think Audrey was hitting on this, like the importance of disclosure, of preparing the ground for them to come in and to work in this way with you. So I think there's a responsibility in it. And I know, and this messiness, because stuff's going to emerge. So then you have to work intuitively, and you can only work intuitively when you have a level of self-awareness and presence. So I think there's a whole lot of work in it, which is really interesting. I'd love to talk more about, I'd love to talk more with people about, but it doesn't get spoken about much. And I think among kind of maybe the peer community I'm in, and I think it might be because a lot of practice leans back on content knowledge. It's still dialing up the content knowledge kind of side of things, which is okay, but then it would be great to speak some more about why that's happening, what the implications of that are. A second thing, and it speaks again to what Audrey was saying, is discomfort as a feature of this. And that's the kind of the need to kind of, and this thing that Audrey was saying about conflict, it might be conflictual, it might be like this, it's difficult, it's not easy. There is, when you set out maybe to kind of prepare something, prepare lessons or prepare something, you are preparing to maybe provoke some discomfort. And I think like there's so many shades of what that could look like. But from the whole of it's maybe people might show up with expectations of maybe an A to Z, or a habit that these folks, these educators, they kind of give us more information about these things, and then we don't. We say sorry, we're not going to, from education experiences they're used to getting, which is the stuff that maybe they feel that would be helpful, but we refuse. It's almost like not a refusal, but we won't give that, but we give this, and this that we offer is maybe going to feel a bit different. Do you still want it? And that can be that obviously you have to kind of work that in, and it's a bit of consensus building around it, a bit of recalibration. But I think as GCE educators, if we're not doing that even a little bit, then we also have to ask ourselves, what's our work, what's our pedagogy in these times, if we're not kind of maybe providing a space where people can shift to another mode of engagement, so that they might be able to discern what it is they need to know more of, what it is they need to have more contact with, how it is they need to move in the world. And then there needs to be obviously on discomfort, like that stuff will just happen in the room, that messiness. Thinking of an example of a response a couple of weeks ago of someone who had a very visceral recall when there was a kind of not standard, but there is a kind of an exercise around power and privilege that would be familiar to some in the room. And she had a very visceral recall with that. And it was just interesting to see, well, interesting because we worked it, and we kind of came to a point where we were with her on it, and we witnessed it. We didn't want to fix it, but we how can I say, we accompanied her in it, and in accompanying with her in it, we were saying we're part of this messy, terrible, unequal system that means you get this recall. But before that step, there was a move among some to quickly want to fix it. Oh, you're up, there's an upset, so let me fix it, and let me remind you that the world is actually a great place. So where does that urge to want to fix? And now there's this instance of recall. I have to fix it. I have to make it. Why fix it? Because you feel uncomfortable? Because you don't want to actually kind of maybe drop into what this is saying about yourself and your implicatedness in the system that the whole exercise has been about exploring. So being able to kind of navigate and work with those moments as well is something about the preparedness. A couple more things I did want to say, and maybe it's got to do with this Howard Zinn quote as well, like working with some of the approaches, like there is such an appetite and capacity for this depth approach. You offer something else to people that give them the chance to engage in different ways. They so quickly will go for it, and they will so quickly, not saying it's perfect, because part of the dissensus and the difficulty and the messiness is part of it, but the appetite for the depth is there. It's just not offered that much. And the other thing that's very clear from the last couple of years is that people can very quickly, with the kind of conditions and the support, can fall into ways of relating with each other that are that are reciprocal, that are based in kind of like mutuality, in kind of deep consideration for each other, like ways of being, ways of learning that are reflecting ways of being that are so antithetical to the worlds that they're used to navigating outside the learning space, which is what kind of is the edge on it, the hierarchical kind of spaces of work and of school, the way you're made to feel most of the time, consumer, client, employee, and not much else. So the chance to kind of engage differently and to kind of relate differently, people will move toward that very quickly, if given the chance. But the question is, are the education spaces giving them that chance to make contact with that, to get a feel for what that is? At the other side, and this is the kind of last point I make, is the risk of capture in some of this, because I know there's a whole, and Audrey has written about this, there's the whole discourse around the merit of this and education curriculum, and you wonder about the risk of capture for corporates, for kind of, I suppose, economic systems that want to keep people productive and engaged in the system and not burning out. These are useful things to kind of, I don't know, trail. That's something that I kind of have an eye on, but also the capture of these elements by the group itself. So I see with groups, this connectivity, this empathy, this relationality that emerges. It feels so good and it feels so different. And so people just then go for it. And the intention of the group you have to keep an eye on, because the intention of the group might be to really just lean more and more into the comfort, the ease, the connection that comes from being in the space. And then maybe that slips into consensus, maybe that slips into kind of like, then there's maybe things that aren't said and that go unsaid but are still in the room, or we forget about the stuff that brought us to the space, which is systemic drivers of injustice, of climate breakdown, of all those things. So it's a bit of a dance, and also kind of keeping an eye on that group intention, but also on ourselves as facilitators. So working with this stuff, also kind of keeping these different things in play and mobilizing them kind of skillfully and working with what emerges, but continually working with what emerges, so that the work can continue, and be of value. And so that maybe loops back to maybe the beginning, and the reflexivity, like the real importance of, maybe especially with this stuff, but maybe always anyway, the importance in education work of reflexivity, of continually paying attention to what you're doing, what people are doing with what you're doing, and what you're doing with what they're doing with what you're doing, cyclical kind of thing. So I hope that was in some way legible, and I'm happy to elaborate maybe on little pieces through the Q&A. Yeah, thank you. It's my time.
Thank you so much, Sive. Gosh, really, I think you took us through that whole spectrum there of engaging with those, what is it to live in those every day in those systems of injustice, and that it's no surprise, I suppose, that it creates these expectations in learning spaces for answers, for a product, for a map, how to prescriptions, and yet yet I think you leave us with that sense of critical hope as well and potential, because of that experience of recognizing that actually we there is an appetite for that depth, and we yearn for those connections. We yearn for that sense of relationship, and to actually deal with those emotions, because it's my favorite line of your whole talk is, there's a lot to feel. There is a lot to feel. So thank you so much for that. I'm not seeing anything in the chat just at the moment, so people are still percolating, I think. And Suprabha, I'd love to move to you and to your offering this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us from Kerala. You can see that night has fallen since we started.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Vicky.
sharing with us.
Thank you. I hope this connection is holds, because I lost some bits here and there. Thank you so much to Audrey and Sive. I mean, it's just remarkable really listening to both of you, and I'm in the presence of great educators, I think, and that's really humbling to listen to your experiences and the breadth of your thought, and the concerns that you have. What I have to offer is like really stories from a rainforest, and I've been in a place called the Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary in the mountains of southern India. They're called the Western Ghat Mountains. And we've been working on plant conservation and habitat restoration for, the place has been doing it for about 50 years, and I've been here for about 30 years. The title of the place, which is Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary, it holds, I think, the full sense of what we're about. And I just wanted to unpack the first word for you, because there's a lot of stuff about Indian philosophy out there which might not, it doesn't fit with how we interpret this word. It just is, guru means teacher, right? One who dispels darkness. For us, the forest is the teacher, nature is the teacher, and all our concerns, mirrored by the natural world, have a completely different dimension to them. They unpack different possibilities than when we just bounce off our each other. So we have placed ourselves right in the middle of the forest and grown back forest and worked with thousands of different species. And into this milieu, we invite people, and they may be, settler migrants. The community here is largely settler migrant, very poor people who have come from other parts of the state. Also indigenous peoples who've been here a long time. And people who come from urban areas. So we welcome them to a place where it's not a human being who is necessarily going to be teaching you something important, but really the non-human beings, or now I think people say it's greater than human or more than human. Just plants and animals and fungi and towering buttress-rooted trees and elephants. And so that spectacular diversity that the rainforest has to offer, which actually was quite, well known by people of this land, of these mountains, has been replaced. 93% of it is gone. So we use the word Holocaust for that. It's Holocaust of an ecological proportion. So, but what does it mean? What does it mean to relate with other beings? And I think both of you, what you have addressed, Audrey and Sive, it's like if we were to just turn that around and ask our birds around us, or butterflies, or mosses. And I had a bunch of students today, this week in fact, that stayed here, college students from the big city of Bangalore, and they're climate science students, and they have all these ideas in their heads. They have so much knowledge. They can tell you everything about weather and the planetary boundaries and the economic systems, solutions. And and they can tell you about social injustice, but they don't really know much about who creates the climate, you know, and what of the biosphere, who are all these others that are working so hard to keep the world going. So that's what we present to them is the lives of other beings. And we walk through a stream, and we walk under these buttress-rooted giant trees, and we look at ferns and mosses and ask these very simple questions. So who's actually solving the problem? You know, who's actually doing it full-bodied in this earnest and, you know, excited and exuberant way? When students, and any student has this intimate connection with another creature, and you know, they're beautiful, many of them are beautiful, many of them are scary, so there's this what I've been calling not enlightenment but enlivenment. So there's a lot of enlivenment that goes on here through the bugs and the snakes. We saw a giant pit viper today, a poisonous snake, beautiful bird-wing butterflies, and all these questions of climate or injustice, you know, just in the presence of non-humans actually just gains a different dimension. And I have found, because I've been quite an activist for many, many years also, and I travel quite a lot and I give talks in different places, but I know nothing like the forest, as good as the forest, to actually speak of all this in, you know, to speak about the essentials of life and an ecological system rather than an economic system, and you know, and who's giving us fresh air, and what solutions can you find in the natural world that you could ally with. So that is exciting for anybody, because you can see the forest at work despite this onslaught on it. And so when we talk about hope, and I prefer to use the word faith, because I have faith in the natural world. I also have faith in human community. Hope is a very difficult one for me, because you know, the system has kind of deprived us of that. But in this huddle of beings, I think you can learn strategies, you can learn tactics, you can have goals, you can you know, you can your body is stronger, your lungs are working better, you have plants that you can grow, you have medicines that you can harvest, your intellect is spiced by thousands of species. And so all these subjects in connection with the natural, direct connection with the natural world, is the best teaching ground that I have you know, experienced. And I think anywhere in the world where you can go out, just to a place under a tree. And you know, so there's this quote by a student who spent some time with us, and I just wanted to share that with you. His name is Popo. It's short for Sabyasachi, and he summed up his time with us in a very simple way. He'd spent, I think, 2 weeks with us, and he said, "Staying at the sanctuary has been a great experience for me." I think he was 15 when he wrote this. "I felt like I was part of a community of a special kind. It was not a community of just people and a community where people are the center of everything. It was a community which also consisted of plants, orchids, ferns, mosses, and trees." And he named a lot of trees, also birds and reptiles, animals, and in this, around everything. "Sometimes I felt like I was a flea living on a large dog." And he put that in quotes, he's in brackets, he said the sanctuary is like a large dog, because you keep having the feeling that the sanctuary is itself alive. There is a lot to learn in this sanctuary about plants, animals, and also about yourself. This is the real wonderland. So that sense that the land is alive, and you know, the air is alive, and we are surrounded. Now, wherever we are in the world, you know, the temperate mountain regions or in the desert, that all these other beings are at work in keeping our world going, and that we can do that too. We can do it just like as beautifully as the butterflies, as you know, in the same way as elephants walking through a place and they rip off some bark and there's some other trees growing in their dung, and to be a large mammal in the forest. And I think when we awaken that sense of interbeing with other creatures, so maybe this complements what both Audrey and Sive had talked about, the sense of so being in the body and to raise these concerns, to empower ourselves with interbeing, through interbeing with other creatures. I've had some years in England with Vicky in this place in southern England, and I felt it there too as a young person. I felt the beauty of the natural world there, and a sense of being a part of something really miraculous and wonderful, but also that so is my body equally miraculous. And this is something that a lot of people leave our, the place is open to day visitors, so you can come for a few hours, but it's also open to residential school programs and long-term programs, as well as internships for young adults. So you can have different sorts of experiences here. But the whole thing is about cultivating and coming intimate, becoming close to non-humans, and to really to have this relational daily conversation with other creatures. And because a part of what we do is plant conservation, it is a garden, so obviously we're growing a lot of plants, but through the plants you come to an enormous diversity of birds and animals, reptiles, and then through that into the world that all these create together. And even though 93% of the biome is gone, what we have evidence of here is that the rainforest is really powerful. I believe quite often that the end of this version of the human race might simply be an alliance with the rainforest. I'm open to that possibility because it is just so immensely powerful, and it's been around for so long. The core areas of rainforests are 100 million years old, so they've seen everything. And that is a very powerful lesson too, that if life came about from a few organic molecules, as the version of science goes, the creation, organic life came from a few molecules, then I don't want to give up on that possibility that there can be an immense unfurling of life still ahead of us. I think climate science, it beats too often on just the negative side. It doesn't show you what the biosphere itself is doing, what the plants are doing, how nitrification, for instance, how plants behave. So we talk a lot about the behavior of plants. What are they doing? What is that, what's happening there? How do these plants grow? What are their strategies? How do they cope with these changes? What worlds are they creating? So everything, every question that you ask of a human being, if you turn that around and ask that of a non-human being, you'll really surprise yourself. And I've seen children just get really excited by these conversations. And it might begin in a somewhat artificial way, because it's a bit strange to talk to a tree or to a butterfly. But if you just turn that question on, how do I feel under this tree, you might then ask the tree, how does the tree feel with me around it? And in a few steps, in a few minutes, you can see children just like wake up to the possibility that this is alive. These are as alive as I am, and they feel and they sense. And you don't have to be airy-fairy about it. They are actual feeling beings. They sense, they perceive. And moment you connect with that perception is going on all around you. And especially in a tropical biome where it's really active, today we had hundreds of leeches on us. So the leeches are sensitive to our presence. We're big mammals walking through the forest, and they climb out onto you. And then you have this sense that you are present and you have a real impact on a place, your own physical being. It's not just the industrial culture, it is your own personal physical being, and also your own emotional being, how fears and phobias often, or the opposite, delight and, the wonderment of things. All this has an impact on other creatures, and you can draw close to birds, you can draw close to deer, to elephants, you can come quite close to elephants, and so I just wonder if all these things that we're talking about can just be, asked of non-humans, and we learn to speak their language, and the language doesn't happen in this way. It's not linear. It's not, words going one after the other. It's deeply emotive, deeply feelingful, deeply sensuous, sensory, and speaking. And when we have indigenous people, it's so normal for them to speak of the thoughts of trees, and it's not at all invented. It's just they're aware of what, of trees in a very different way, of animals. They speak of them in very different ways. So that's another thing that I've been exploring, is that that different cultures seem to have different behaviors based upon different perceptions, and that is based upon different experiences of the natural world. So when we go to something very deep like that, the very experiencing of life, then we can evolve our own language and therefore shape perception. So that's kind of what I just wanted to bring to you, that it's an exciting world to be part of, the rainforest. It's full of possibilities. We are reckoning with the enormous changes wrought by industrial culture upon the body of the earth. And it's not disempowering, it is actually empowering. So I'd like to end on that. If people come back to me with questions, and I hope that you all come and visit this place, as Vicky has done many years ago, and we can walk together in the forest and feel this together. Okay.
Oh, Suprabha, thank you so much. Really, thank you so much. I think you offer such another perspective. As you're saying, that climate science, it has a lot to offer, but it does overwhelmingly focus on the negative, and pays very little attention to, as you're saying, what the biosphere is doing. That sense of doing came out so strongly again and again. And that word entanglement, I think, has been kind of there through the whole afternoon. And you, I think, offered us another way of understanding a kind of entanglement, quite a rapturous kind of entanglement, actually, in its own way. And I'm definitely taking away 2 new words in my vocabulary now of enlightenment, was it? Just really beautiful. And interbeing, those are going in my dictionary. Thank you so much, Suprabha,
Great.
and Audrey and Sive, and to everyone who has been with us in this space and holding the space together. We were proposing to take a short break now, and that when we come back, we're going to invite Audrey, Sive, and Suprabha to take a little bit of time in case they'd like to respond to each other, and a little bit more entanglement, perhaps, that we could do after the break, and then to open that up to for all of us, if it's something you'd like to say through the mic, or if you're happier using text, that is all fine. Just in terms of how much time, I'm going to defer to Thomas or Hilary to see when should we come back, because I'm a little bit innumerate, so I'm probably going to give us an hour's break if my mistake.
They're maybe quite short. I'm just conscious of how late it is where Suprabha is, and maybe in 5 or 6 minutes. So in 6 minutes, whatever time that is. So 5 to 4 here. Just a few minutes.
Great. We come back at 5 to.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. See you all soon. I felt really compelled to run out into the garden straight away, Suprabha. So we have a little bit of time that we could open up now to our three guests. If there is something that you heard in each other's offerings, if there's anything that you'd like to respond to, anything that chimed for you, you're very welcome to take a couple of minutes now to share that with us. I know these kind of live and unrehearsed moments are not always the easiest, but if there's anything you'd like to share, please. And I'm not going to call on anyone to start with that, but feel free to volunteer.
Hi there.
Thanks, Audrey.
Yeah, well, just to thank Sive and Suprabha for such incredible, really, fascinating and enriching, and dare I say, enlivening inputs. I mean, my mind is blown. It's lots of kind of thoughts swirling around, but I suppose one of the things that was so vital for me was in Suprabha's presentation, just this reminder to us all about the importance of transcending this human-centric framework that dominates education, that dominates, all spheres of our lives. And I just thought that the portrait that you presented for us, that you painted for us, was so stunning in terms of capturing, I think you described it as the spectacular diversity of the rainforest. It was just such a rich sort of series of images. I felt, you spoke about kind of proximity. I felt through your description, I felt very close to the rainforest, even though I'm thousands of miles away. And just this idea of just the myriad of ways that it's keeping the world going. I was really struck by that expression. I thought it was very powerful and helped me to have faith, just in terms of the way you spoke about faith. And I especially loved that description of the rainforest as a real wonderland. I mean, what a rich description. It's so life affirming. And I suppose it also just struck me how important it is to look at these real world examples of speaking back to the bleakness, and just this sort of constant sort of doomism, and the importance of kind of disconfirming evidence around that and how empowering that can be. And this notion that there are spaces and places and the more than human realm, which is filled with possibility. Like, I think that's a really important reminder. I also just loved the way you spoke about children's excitement about being asked to sort of frame questions, to pose questions of trees, of butterflies, of plants, as you would humans. I thought that was just really, really powerful. And, their excitement in that was kind of palpable, listening to your account and your description. But I suppose ultimately what your presentation underscored for me was just the necessity of a really radical paradigm shift within education, and moving us away from this human-centric way of relating to the world. So whether that's through kind of, post-humanist, new materialist kind of approaches, which I think, they're starting to enter the discourse, but I don't think we have a very good handle on what that can look like. But I think your input really gave us a really wonderful vision of how to enliven those spaces. So thank you so much. And I might just say, maybe pick up on a couple of things that struck me about Sive's presentation. Like, I thought you just captured the importance of the more sensory, more affective pedagogy so gorgeously, Sive, just through the language that you used, and just, I suppose, your way of approaching it. And you know, just listening to you, I suppose it struck me that one of the reasons why I think we're so fixated on knowledge and these very rationalist approaches, and you know, this, you spoke about the urge to fix, is because of, I suppose, the funding mechanisms and how everything is very output driven, you know, and there's this, you know, expectation that resources that will be produced. And I suppose it just struck me as sort of a failure of imagination in ways. We really need to start to think how we can respond to those kind of funding mechanisms and funding models, and maybe start to, you know, shape the narrative a lot more in terms of, and maybe shift the dial in terms of what outputs might look like, or what constitutes an output or an outcome. But I think one of the other things that I did kind of consider when I was listening to you was the importance of not issuing knowledge altogether. And I sometimes see this, you know, because I work in the primary education space, and it's almost like with the kind of active participatory learning emphasis, that knowledge is no longer deemed to be important in any way. So, you know, children are asked, you know, a series of questions, but there's virtually no kind of content to act as this kind of compass that you've spoken about, you know. So I think it's important that we strike a balance between the kind of the cognitive, the epistemic, and the, you know, the affective, so that they can work productively together. And then maybe just the other thing that kind of struck me was, you know, you touched upon this question of, you know, in whose interests are particular emotions being mobilized. And, you know, we have this whole kind of social emotional learning agenda now, which is infiltrating schools, it's infiltrating universities, so it's infiltrating all levels of the system. And to my mind, it's one of the most concerning developments within education, because I suppose it's in terms of who's dictating this agenda, for starters. And you know, you mentioned it was very corporatist, and it's very prescriptive, and it's highly depoliticizing. You know, so I think within the global citizenship space, we have to watch it. There's a lot of emphasis now on, you know, inner development rather than sustainable development, and on the cultivation of particular types of emotions, which are, so it's almost like, you know, learning is being viewed in terms of the outcome, you know, and filling students is being envisioned in terms of filling students with particular kinds of emotions, which are regarded as skills, whether it's empathy, compassion, mindfulness, critical thinking, resilience. And I think we really need to watch this space and speak back to it and problematize it, because it is heavily corporatist, and it's fulfilling the needs of a big check agenda. And yeah, we need to kind of really, I suppose, present an alternative vision of what, you know, affective or the role of emotions in education might look like. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Audrey. Supi or Sive, is there anything you'd like to share?
I had an insight maybe from listening to both of you, Audrey and Sive, that schooling in India is at a different point perhaps than I'm not seeing the kind of shutdown. Maybe it's all about aspiration, and people are leaving the land base and migrating to cities, and all in search of something better. And the rural part of India has been hammered in the last 40-50 years, and migration is a big thing. But just that, I don't think the students are that I have met are where you seem to be describing students in your part of the world. There is a rational disaster. There is definitely the competitiveness and despair from not doing well at school, and the kind of the very mechanical nature of education is very strong. But that sense of disempowerment from education in terms of the big picture of climate and the existential crisis, I don't know that Indian schooling is there yet, because it's sort of upwardly, it's pointing towards this upwardly mobile kind of feeling, no matter what it actually does. So just wondering if you feel that there's been a shift in the last 10, 20, 30 years. Has something happened that people are more in this sort of despair kind of situation?
I think certainly in the context.
Can I speak to, would you mind if I interrupted for a moment?
You're not interrupting, Emer, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I thought maybe you wanted to continue a dialogue between the three speakers who were so fascinating. In fact, I was just typing an apology for hopping in and out, but everything, I couldn't possibly leave you for a moment, because everything you're saying is so exactly where I'm finding difficulty. And to answer the Indian lady whose name I quite don't have, who spoke well about the forest, I'm at the connection between what was spoken of in this Earth Charter course that I'm studying, and speaking to nature and allowing nature speak directly to children. And in terms of, she's asking what has happened to change or to increase the emotional distance between the content and the student's inner life. And one of the things here in Ireland that I'm experiencing, and it's a blame game here in Ireland, is the phone, that they relate to their phone, which only gives them a stream of straight consciousness, straight facts, without sources, without emotional context. And that they're used to learning in this way from the phone, which is completely removed from any kind of internal transformative learning that might take place. So these facts come to them in streams on their electronic devices, or games, and there are further interactions there, that they're missing out on learning how to process their personal reaction to information. So that when they come to the classroom and they have a human being like me standing in front of them, I present a further stream of information in my classroom. But when I turn to engaging in the systems thinking of how our decisions as families and food consumers relate to what's happening in the economy, and how, if we purchase a banana here, where has it come from? What society has affected? If we stop buying those bananas, will people lose their incomes? But I find that students completely disconnect at this time, because it's over challenging to them. And as I mentioned in my message earlier, they discover stress and they wish to not engage with that stress. So that's one answer to your question. And thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Emer. Thanks. And also thanks for taking such trouble to be with us today, because I know you were teaching at the same time. And so we really appreciate you making that effort. I'm just going to come back to Sive in case you'd like to add anything to that response or reflection from the three of you, and then we're going to be opening it out.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. Just very quickly to say, yeah, with Supra, the forest and the rainforest, it was, you know, you did take us on a journey, and I was able to kind of very quickly feel like I was there and connecting with the more than human beings you were naming, and it's just a reminder to me also, like, I think it's not that difficult, even in a sterile classroom environment. Okay, not too sterile, but it's possible to bring them in quite easily. And it's just reminding me of this. And I think I just have to be reminded more and more and more, because I see it more and more and more. You can very quickly bring them in. You know, you don't have to be, we were lucky enough to be painted the picture of your forest, and it's where you are now. But we don't have to be somewhere physical with them to bring them in. And then I think there's a real symmetry between bringing them in and bringing the emotions in, like bringing the body in also, because the body has many shades of feelings in one moment. That wonderful diversity you spoke of is inside of each of us, good, bad, ugly, you know, capable of all things. And we're not one thing, we're many parts, and we're also everything. So that work, that somatic work with the body has real symmetry with that for me, with what you were, not for me, but I know it does with the world you're describing. And then, and how quickly I think it is possible for us, in spite of the increasingly disembodied kinds of spaces, that disembodied kind of learning spaces we're finding ourselves in, and maybe the reduced level of contact with that kind of space. It's just, for me, the faith is that, not the faith, because I see it, people are very quickly able to come back into contact with that. They're not so far away from it as we think. So for me, that's the hope, the faith. And then also to what Audrey was saying about the capture of some of this stuff, or the even I saw Nora's comment there, how do we work with the emotion, the knowledge, the enlightenment, how do we bring them into play with each other in the learning spaces, like pedagogically? And I just think that's a conversation I want to have more of with people, with peers. And I just don't see it really happening that much. So that's just to say, you know, and to so that we can be vigilant, you know, that we can use these elements wisely and work with them intuitively as well, because that's what it requires, is intuitive working with these elements. But I think that requires reflection, and I think peers to reflect with, and yeah, it's quite a work. So then that's just like a call out to anybody who is interested in that kind of conversation to really, I would love to be part of it, because it's tricky and it's delicate and it's really important. So thank you, Audrey, for naming it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Sive, and thank you to the three of you. I'm really struck by just the diversity in your approaches, and yet there is such harmony within them as well, how they've chimed with each other, and just how incredibly important the conversation this afternoon has been. We were talking earlier about the despair that young people often express. I've been in classrooms where, just before the pandemic, when there was a lot of news coverage, I suppose, of forests on fire, and young people in classrooms asking, are we going to die? You know, is this the end? Or young people in the classroom saying, we have been told since we were born that the earth is dying. And how do they carry that? And just what I've heard this afternoon just offers such a sense of the fallacy of that, I suppose. And that when that overwhelm comes, whether we're looking at economics, which in FJI we more usually are, or whether we're looking at ecology, I'm just reminded of the title of a book by John Holloway, Crack Capitalism. The idea that, yes, the system, of course, we can't overhaul an entire system, but we can work in the cracks. And, you know, whether there's ants, whether there's little plants growing in there, those cracks are fertile places. So thank you so, so much to all three of you. I'm going to hand back to Thomas now, and look forward to hearing more comments and more reflection. Thank you.
Vicky, thanks again to Sive, Audrey and Suprabha. We just wanted to open the space now for questions and comments from everybody else. There's a couple of things in the chat already that I might read through, and then we might just open the floor then to anybody else has any comments or questions. One of the things, this was Nora who had to leave, and she was just asking the question about how to successfully combine emotional knowledge and enlightenment. And then Emer, who you were talking a little bit about this already, the disconnect between real life and nature. And then, yeah, I think this might have been you, Hilary. So the challenge as an educator to support learners to overcome psychic barriers about economic injustice, as well as existential threats. And then thinking specifically about the economic and ideas of complicity and implicatedness in relation to economic injustice, and how this topic comes up in different spaces. Thanks for all the effort to stay connected. Yeah, so those couple of things, and just to open up to anybody else who would like to ask a question or make a comment on what we've heard so far.
I might offer something if I can. Yeah, I really enjoyed the talks, the different presentations. Thank you very much, and even to hear from Emer, from a teacher directly, and I speaking from a facilitator who is trying to find the cracks, as Vicky mentioned, to get into schools and have time with students, and finding it harder than ever before. So harder than before COVID lockdown, thinking that there would be more space and more time once things opened, that there would have been a shift and a change. But I find our program, Self-Help Africa, I'm speaking of now, so trying to come into secondary schools to talk about food and agriculture, sustainable food systems and trade justice. Our ideal as an offering would be to come 3 times. And I don't think I've managed that at all with any school. I've struggled to get to meet a group twice. And more often than not, I get to meet a group once. So then I struggle with, like you, Audrey, was saying, this need of my own to overload that group with information because of the thinness of that crack in the system to offer anything, and also being mindful that I have no knowledge of these young people. I'm very often totally unprepared by teachers of who I'm in front of, and I'm aware that they could be living in direct provision. They could be from the Ukraine. So to talk about an emotive journey in front of a group of people that you have no grounding in, I've found that I've had to pull away from some of the things that I would have done in the past, because I'm just I'm not willing to risk that. And teachers and schools don't facilitate that information very well at all, even asked. And then one very quick example of something I experienced in a class school recently that just hit me very hard was, after a lot of communicating with a science teacher to speak with the science students in first and second year, and him liaising with the rest of the science faculty that I would get to speak to their students, I arrived to a group of classes amalgamated together. So I had between 70 and 90 students in different sessions in a very loud hall. And before I could meet with the colleagues of the teacher that arranged this engagement, he very loudly announced, so that the students could hear as well. He says, "I can handle this lot. You guys go off and do something else," to the teachers. So even though we had been communicating about how important it was that the teachers were in the session as well, and that the learning was for everyone, and the teachers were delighted, jumped up smiling, and off they went to have an hour to themselves. So. And there I was left with all their students plus one teacher who made it very clear that he was only there to step in to pull people out as and when they crossed his line. And that was after so much discussion and communication with this teacher. And there were other moments that he said things like to his colleague during the break, she's going, "Oh, how's the thing in the hall?" And he goes, "Oh, we're doing that. We're ticking the boxes: sustainability, climate action, social justice." In front of me, ticking boxes. So this is the challenges that drew me to this discussion. And I think I'll stop there. That was quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, some of those tensions are definitely reflected in our own work, and one of the things that we've been trying to put more emphasis on is that relationship building and slowing things down to do the needs assessment and context analysis for the groups, target groups that we're working with, and this space probably emerged from one of those processes of slowing things down and doing those sort of taking the time to do that listening and that relationship building with people, and to sort of to hear what the challenges have been, and this space I think has grown out of that. But there is a real tension that we experience as we do that, sort of the pressure, some of that, what Audrey was saying about targets and the whole model, and the sort of the pressure to deliver. So just that tension of the relational nature of a lot of what we're talking about, and the pressures in terms of time, resources, expectations, and the context that we're working in, something that we've definitely been experiencing ourselves. Anybody else in terms of questions or comments?
Could I just say thanks very much to everybody. I've been running around kind of driving kids to classes and stuff, but I've been kind of trying to keep an ear on everything that's been said, and it's really interesting. Thanks very much. And I feel like I've been having rainforest explosions in my head, along with everything else that we've been thinking about and talking about. In Children in Crossfire at the minute, we're reviewing our Educating the Heart teacher training programme for global education. I've talked to Audrey, and Sive works with us, and Suprabha, I'd really love to talk to you more. So I'm hoping that we'll all be giving each other's contact details, I hope, afterwards, Thomas, so as that we can keep in contact and talk more. Because I'm just thinking, like, when we're doing this global education, we do try to get outside, Sive and Vicky, don't we, when we're facilitating this? And I just think that we need to incorporate that much more explicitly and be in nature. That whole being outside, being not being in nature, but realizing that we are within it, that it's not human-centric. I think that is so important. And I think in other areas of my life, that the message has been being screamed in my head: get outside, wear, throw yourself into the sea, whatever. And I think that that's something that a lot of people have been focusing on more recently, and that whole positive aspect. And I think that overcoming those psychic barriers that Audrey was talking about, and that critical hope, that and I just absolutely love that term, enlightenment. And I think that's something that we're all going to be using a bit more, and incorporating that into actually being outside while we're doing these issues, and introducing that idea of critical hope through that is something that I'm really excited about. But I'll be quiet now, and I'll be in touch with, let's see if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. We can facilitate that, and we're definitely open to pursuing this conversation further. This is where we think what we are trying to do is figure out where the economic and financial stuff fits. How do you put it in its place? It's like and do it well. So it needs to be in this bigger conversation. I feel like we're in the right place, to put the economic and the financial, to give it its, the not lose the substance, but just as part of a much bigger conversation. I think that's come through really, really well, particularly Audrey's analysis of the, how did you put it? You talked about helping people to understand what function their emotional reactions are having, and whose interests they're serving. And I just thought that, it's just sort of hitting the spot, where this some of these tensions are at, and where we need to sort of open more spaces for that, without losing that political and the economic components. So we'd be really delighted to continue that, Nora, and we'll definitely get back in contact. I know we're coming right up to the time we said we'd finish. So just if nobody has any other, I think a couple of people have left things in the chat. Yeah, ecological systems, not economic systems. Okay, great. Yeah, so we have a couple of just plugs, I suppose, to make for our own work before we finish up. This is part of a series of seminars that we're running at the end of this sort of academic cycle. I'm just going to share my screen with you for a second to show you what we've got coming up. So this is next week. We've got Professor John Barry and Tatiana Roa, a speaker from Colombia, and we've been looking at this whole area of degrowth, inspired by yourself, Audrey, as well, and some of your work. And that if we're not talking about this and sort of digging into this, I think you said we're on the wrong side of history. So yeah, we're digging into this, and we've got different aspects of our work in this general area of beyond growth. And so this is a really exciting seminar that we have next Wednesday in the evening, so we can share details with that with you. And finally, this weekend in Cork, we have this weekend-long workshop. It's a collaboration with Creativity and Change that some of you might be familiar with their work. Yeah, so looking at creative methodologies, and they work from a sort of creativity and a big focus on arts practitioners. And so this is our first collaboration with Creativity and Change, sort of a weekend-long workshop. So yeah, we're Vicky will be leading on this this weekend in Cork. So if you're interested, or anybody in your networks are interested, we'd really appreciate getting the word out, and do get in contact with us directly on that. And then finally, I'm not going to keep you. I know people have, particularly our speakers. I can send this link to our feedback evaluation form by email to each of you afterwards. Yeah, just so as not to keep you any longer. Particularly, Suprabha, I can see it's getting darker and darker in the background in your. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just to stay in touch, our contact details. So we really appreciate all of you being here this evening, and a special thanks to Audrey, to Sive, and to Suprabha for your participation today, and we look forward to following up with you in different ways as we sort of pursue this conversation further together. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks again for the invite.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, everybody, for yeah, showing up, and thanks to the organisers also for inviting me along. And great to meet you, Suprabha.
Thank you. Real pleasure to meet all of you. I mean, couldn't have imagined talking to a whole bunch of people in Ireland. Really, it's just wonderful. And I just want to say that although I'm a rainforest champion, I believe every part of the world is spectacular, and that the human body is spectacular. Ocean. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Suprabha, for joining us.
Sorry?
Just to thank you again for joining us, for taking the time, and yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye. I'm so glad I came. I only heard your existence